All right, so we're going to get started here. Sorry, I had to get you on the right slide here. We're going to start with perceptual organization today with a screencast, and we're going to be taking a look at Gestalt psychology and understanding how, in order to transform sensory information into meaningful perceptions, we first have to organize it. So when we talk about top-down processing, these organizational principles that are identified by the German Gestalt psychologist really do emphasize the importance of top-down processing. Gestalt is a German word. It means an organized whole. So in the early 20th century, these German psychologists became fascinated with how our mind organizes sensations into perceptions, and they noticed that when we're given a cluster of sensations, our brain naturally tends to organize them into a meaningful whole. So that's what this is really all about. And if you take a look at the illustration underneath the definition of Gestalt, you might perceive the cross in a circle, and you might perceive the 4 pie pieces within the circle. It just depends on how you perceive it. But we don't typically see it as individual separate pieces. We look at it and appreciate it as a whole. That's why sometimes you hear people refer to the idea that the whole may exceed the sum of its parts. That's a Gestalt philosophy. A big part of form perception with Gestalt psychology is the figure ground. It's the organization of the visual field into objects, which are the figure, that stand out from their surroundings, which is the ground. So if you take a look, you might perceive a vase, and you would see the vase would be the figure and the black would be the ground. Or if you see 2 faces, the black would be considered the figure and the white would be considered the ground. When you're told it's reversible, it's a lot easier to perceive a figure-ground illusion, and that again illustrates top-down processing. Here are a couple of figure-ground illusions. So if you see men walking down steps, the men would be the figure, the white would be the ground. If you perceive the arrows going opposite directions, you would say the figure was the white and the black was the ground. In this illusion, you might see a man playing a horn, or you might see a woman's silhouette, depending on what your perception is. Another important concept with Gestalt psychology are grouping principles. And I will say these sometimes tend to get a little tricky because there are 5 of them. There are the 4 listed on this screen, and then on my next slide, you will see grouping. So you'll have scenario-based questions on the test that will have A, B, C, D, and E being the 5 grouping choices. So you really need to be able to distinguish the difference between them. Grouping is the perceptual tendency to organize stimuli into coherent groups. So if we take a look at proximity, it's the idea that we group nearby figures together. It's just natural. So when you look at the lines, it's most likely you perceive 3 roads versus 6 independent separate lines. With proximity with people, you might use as an example, if you work at like Cub Foods or some kind of like Target where you're a cashier and you're checking people out, you might assume people are together if they're standing close to one another. I know I had a student who mentioned that, they worked at like Famous Footwear, and they would come up to people and ask them if they needed help. Just because they were standing together, they assumed that they were together. And then it was a little awkward when they weren't. So that's proximity, just simply geographic nearness. With similarity, you can see the different shapes, the triangles, the circles, and the triangles. Because the shapes are similar, we oftentimes perceive them as vertical lines of shapes. First triangles, then 3 circles and 3 triangles. We don't typically look at it horizontally and group them across from one another. Oftentimes, we do group figures together that are similar to one another. Example, people that look like each other, we might perceive them as family members. I know sometimes when I walk into or like look out on the football practice field, I have a hard time sometimes distinguishing which group is the varsity group, the 10th grade group, or the 9th grade group, because they all are wearing football helmets and they're all wearing shoulder pads, and they all look alike. Continuity is when we perceive smooth, continuous patterns rather than discontinuous ones. So when you think about that particular image, we oftentimes perceive the straight line with a wavy line running through it. We don't see it as disconnected half moons that are upside down from one another. Just like when we're watching a television show, even though the television show you're watching might move from scene to scene and fade in and out, we perceive it as one continuous, smooth storyline. On the right, you see the connectedness example. Connectedness is basically saying because they're uniform and linked that we perceive the two dots and the line between them as a single unit. I kind of look at it as like a barbell. We don't see them as separate, like two circles that have a line in between them. We see them as one uniform unit. When you think about this, I oftentimes use as an example rungs on a ladder, or even railroad tracks with the ties in the middle. Or if you have like the letter T or a letter X, we don't see them as four separate lines that are joined in the middle. We perceive it as one letter, even though there's intersections. The last grouping principle is closure. Now, when you look at this illusion, it allows for us to tend to fill in the gaps to complete a whole object. So we assume that the circles are complete, but they're just being partially blocked by that illusory triangle. I'm guilty a lot of times of finishing people's sentences. If they start something and they pause, it's like I want closure. And so I'll fill in the rest of their sentence, and then sometimes people look at me like, no, that's not what I was going to say. I'm guilty of this with my daughter, especially. She gets frustrated with me. Another example that I like to use is when you're at a sporting event and the bulbs on the scoreboard are burnt out. We automatically can figure out what number is being illuminated, even if there are missing bulbs, if they're burnt out. And that's just another example of closure. Here's another fun example, like Wheel of Fortune. Can you fill in the blanks? Can you bring closure to the words? And this is a true legitimate statement, people. I do hope you get a 5 on the AP exam. Truly. All right. And the last thing that I'm going to be talking about today is simply the depth perception. When you're talking about, perception, chapter 6, a big part of it is dealing with depth, which is the ability to see objects in 3 dimensions, although the images that strike the retina are 2-dimensional. It allows us to judge distance. So this is just a fun little picture of a dog that obviously had some depth perception issues because his eyes were closed. All right, one device that was created in the 1960s allowed for sensory perception psychologists, S&P psychologists, to figure out whether or not depth perception was an innate ability or if it was learned. So a little nature versus nurture test. And they devised this miniature cliff with a glass-covered drop-off to determine whether crawling infants and newborn animals could perceive depth. What they did find out, and I do think it's good for you to watch the actual YouTube clip that I have on here, is that when infants and animals are coaxed across the glass plane, they really still are reluctant to venture over the glass, and they feel as if they're going to fall. So really, in conclusion, we know that every species, by the time they're mobile, do have the perceptual abilities they need. That depth perception is, in fact, innate. However, there is a little bit of the nurture component because they know that an infant's wariness and hesitancy does increase with experience when they crawl, no matter when they begin to crawl. So depth perception is innate, but it is definitely enhanced by our environment and our experiences. And that is it for today. Tomorrow's lesson, I'm going to specifically focus on binocular and monocular cues.